In this section, we'll be dealing with the skeletalized remains. We have our hands on the skeletalized remains of a person, not on a fresher body, not on a decomposed body, just the skeleton. So, how are we going to identify such a person in such a condition? Still, there are a lot of factors in hand that basically can establish the personal identity of a person with 100% accuracy, even in a skeletalized remain. So, what are the factors and why is it important? We are already done with that. But what are the factors that are basically going to contribute towards the personal identification of this person? The identification of the DNA characteristics. Now, the DNA is the mainstay in the skeletalized remains. While we are identifying the certain person, the identification of the skeletalized remains and the categorization of the skeletalized remains. We even have to categorize them into different categories whenever we get them. We can have fragments, we can have the full bones, we can have the full stature of the person. So different categories are dealt on with differently. Now, as I've already told you, it's the DNA that is the mainstay in the identification of a person whenever we are dealing with a skeletalized remains. The genetic testing, of course. So, every person has basically got a certain peculiar finger pattern that he has, and it is not basically familiar to the other people. So, they are not, even if we do a comparative study, we'll get prints differently from different people. But still, there is it is very confusing at times because certain traits are basically there are minimal changes. So we have to get in a lot of details whenever we are establishing the identity of the person. So the genetic testing is very important at the other hand. Then the PCR, the fingerprinting. So all of these come into play whenever we are dealing with the DNA characteristics. The genetic testing, first of all, the PCR is the polymerase chain reaction, basically. So it is very characteristic for people and it is going to point towards the DNA characteristics of the person. And thirdly, the fingerprinting. Fingerprinting is not only the only characteristic of the DNA that basically comes into play whenever we are basically identifying the DNA of a certain person. So all of these things collectively contribute towards the establishment of the identity of the certain person. Now, identification of the skeletalized remains, what is the procedure? The allotting the bones to the general categories based on absolute criteria concerning species, ancestry, sex, of course, whether he's a male, whether he's a female, the general stature of the person, tall, short, and obese, if he's lean, the age of the person, infant or middle-aged or an adult age person, and the date on whatever this procedure is being performed. It is very important. So this is basically the whole procedure, and this is the whole criteria that is going to establish the complete identity of a person, the ancestry, of course. Now, secondly, on the other hand, there are comparative studies where the remains are matched against the ante-mortem data. But not in all cases. Not in all cases do we have the comparative study at our hand. It is derived from those people who might be the potential victims or the relatives of the person, of course. But in some cases, we don't even have the victims at our hand. We don't even have the relatives at our hand. So in cases where there is no ante-mortem comparison available, it is very difficult to establish the identity of such person. Now, general categorization of the skeletal remains. This is very important. Are they bones? First of all, as we have discussed in detail, why is it important to basically personally identify the person? And then moving on to establish if they are bones. Now, in certain cases, there were certain examples. For example, basically the bone similes were found at the crime scene, and they were confused with the actual bones. For example, in mass disasters, there are a lot of things around, and when you get on your hands on those debris, you even get your hands on the artificial. You can even get your hands on the artificial bones, the simulated bones. They're also called as the simulated bones. So these simulated bones are very difficult to distinguish from the real bones, but we can perform a lot of tests. For example, the chemical test can be performed to basically establish whether it is a real human bone or it is made up out of plastic, even the ceramic, or just for study purposes. A lot of these things are available in the market as well. So after we have established that these are actually bones, we are going to move on to whether they're human bones. So even a lot of bones, the long bones, of course, they cannot be confused with the animal bones. For example, the thigh bone, it cannot be confused with the human bone, of course. If we give a comparison to the human bone or the cow's bone or the sheep bone or the chicken bones, they cannot be confused with each other. But the fragments of the bone, of course. If we have fragmentary parts of the bone, they can be confused with smaller bones of the animals, of course. But then again, we have a lot of distinguishing characteristics. We can basically distinguish them through histologies of the bones. So whenever they are put on the histology patterns, there are different Haversian canals differences in them. The normal osteology of the human bones, as it is well known, it can be compared with the animal bones, and they have a different structure, of course. So what is the sex of the person? So there are a lot of bones. For example, in a general rule to the bones is basically the male bones are heavier, they are more rugged, and they have prominent muscular ridges. So even on a speculated view, on a general view, we can distinguish whether it is a male or a female bone. The female bone, on the other hand, will be lighter, it will be less rugged, and the muscular ridges will be lighter in the female bone. So then moving on, when we are dealing, for example, the pelvis is shown over here. Now, the pelvis has certain characteristics in the male and the female. So the females have basically, there are a lot of characteristics and it's dealt in the subsequent sections when we will be dealing with the pelvis. The outlet, the inlet, the shape, the muscular ridges, all of these basically contribute towards the sexing of the bones, whether it is a male or it is a female. So what is the stature of the person? So there are a lot of formulas for the stature calculations. There is the Pleats formula, and there are a lot of tables that can be calculated. There are certain statistics that we have to put in that. Even a fragment of the bone, even if we have a tibia at our hand, even if we have a fibula at our hand, we can basically put these calculations in those formulas and we can get a complete stature of the person. But the stature of the person is basically, even the height of the person is calculated from the crown to the heel, not to the toe, because the toe is basically it goes into a rigidity phase, and it basically can, if we take the height from the crown to the toe, it will add a few centimeters to the height. So we don't want to do that because that will cause a discrepancy. So what is the ancestry or the race of the person? The person has certain ancestry and certain race. Basically, the racial features are quite distinguished, and the ancestry can also be established by the bones of the person, the general stature of the person, the general physique of the person. It is common for certain ancestries. What is the age of the person? Now, it is also a very important question. These are basically the general questions that we'll be asking when we are establishing the personal identity of the person. What is the age of the person? The age of the person can also be estimated through these bones. The ossification centers are basically the main landmarks that come into play whenever we are categorizing the age of the bones. So how long have they been dead or concealed? The time since death, that can also be calculated by the changes that are occurring in the bones. What was the cause of death? That is the mainstay, of course. Whenever we are establishing the identity, we'll also be focusing on the cause of death on the other hand. So are the bones of human origin? The size is assessed and many small slender bones excluded on obvious grounds, and gross anatomy is then studied for any bone. Even we can have a humerus at our hand and we can deal with that. Histological examination may offer a species differentiation and serological investigations. And then finally, there is a DNA testing that is performed on these bones to basically establish the identity of the person most accurately. So in this section, basically we dealt with how are we going to move on whenever we have a skeletonized body at our hand, and how are we going to establish the personal identity of that person in that case. That was the end to this section. Thank you for watching sqadia.com.